Welcome to Lecture 11 of Introduction to the Sikhs. In today's lecture, I'll talk about literature and film. And again, as in the case of art, I'll just give a very few examples, but enough hopefully to whet your appetites to explore more thoroughly. So Sikh literature we can think of as divided into perhaps four categories. One is sacred literature, and this includes, of course, the main sacred text, the Guru Granth Sahib, but also what I'd call a secondary text, the Dasam Granth, which is a compilation around the time of Guru Gobind Singh, and it includes some works of Guru Gobind Singh himself, but also works of others. And then the works of Bhai Gurdas, who was a relative of Guru Arjan and who was the scribe of the original manuscript of the Ad Granth, which became the Guru Granth Sahib. And his works also a very important part of the Sikh canon. The second category is the Janam Sakhis, which I talked about a little bit in the context of Sikh art, and these are stories of Guru Nanak's life. I'll say a little bit more about them today. And then modern prose and modern poetry. So I'll start with the Guru Granth Sahib and give you some just brief examples. It's a very, very long text, and it's written almost exclusively in poetry with meter and rhyme. It's organized according to rags, the musical modes of Indian classical music tradition. This composition is from early in the text on page 14 in Sri Rag. And what I'll just point out to you is the use of metaphor in these verses on this slide and the next. The Guru is addressing the divine and describing how limitless the divine is and how difficult it is to understand and make that connection. And the Guru talks about, for example, being cut into pieces and ground into flour and still not being able to understand the greatness of the divine, and then talks about flying and being invisible, neither eating nor drinking, and then in another metaphor trying to write on hundreds of thousands of stacks of paper with limitless ink. So again, the idea is to use poetic metaphors from daily life to convey the limitlessness of the divine. This is a composition from later in the Guru Granth Sahib. Again, the organization is according to rags. This is in Rag Tukhari. This is from a composition known as Barama, 12 months. And here the organizing theme is the different months of the Indian calendar. In this selection, the month is Sawan, which is part of the rainy season, the monsoon season in India. And the Guru says the rainy season has come and the clouds have burst into showers. And this is the metaphor here is of love for the divine, and the beloved is pining for her husband. And again, there's a gender aspect here, which I'll talk about in a future lecture. But this is actually a common metaphor in the Indian religious poetry of this time. The final example I want to give from Guru Granth Sahib is from around the middle of the text, and this is in Rag Tilang. And this is, again, a very nice metaphor where being connected with the divine is described as like a shawl being dyed so that the color is mixed, becomes part of the cloth. And so in that sense, the connection is immutable and unchangeable. So there's, again, many wonderful poetic metaphors in the Guru Granth Sahib. There's also a lot of imagery of nature, which is, I think, particularly interesting in the context of modern thought about the value of the environment. So here again are the two paintings I showed you earlier in the last lecture from the life of Guru Nanak. This is from a Janam Sakhi manuscript, illustrated manuscript from the early 19th century. And these are, of course, real-life events from Guru Nanak's life. But there's another kind of Janam Sakhi which tells stories which may or may not be documented. In this story, which is known as Sacha Sauda, True Bargain, Guru Nanak, as a young boy, was given money by his father to buy supplies for their business. But instead, he uses the money to buy food to feed some wandering holy men. And there's actually a verse in the Guru Granth Sahib which refers to Sacha Sauda. So one can conjecture that the story was written later to connect to the verses in the Guru Granth Sahib. But it's certainly a very plausible account of Guru Nanak, even though we don't have a contemporary record of his childhood. There are other stories from the Janam Sakhis which are much more in the nature of miracle stories, and from a modern scientific point of view, we would not assign them literal truth, but still they are used to illustrate the greatness of Guru Nanak and the moral principles that he taught. Now turning to modern prose, this is so modern Punjabi prose starts to develop in the 19th century, especially the second half of the 19th century. It's influenced by the colonial presence and also by the widespread availability of the printing press at this time. And Bhai Veer Singh is perhaps the most important, influential Sikh writer, especially in the context of his time. He wrote novels which were set in the 18th century mainly, and they were written to inspire the Sikh community by providing heroic tales from the 18th century, again, a time of resistance to Mughal oppression. So Bhai Veer Singh's novel Sundari is set in that first half of the 18th century. It was published in 1898. The story involves a young Hindu girl who is kidnapped by the Mughals, but she's rescued by her brother, who has converted to Sikhism, and she also becomes a Sikh and fights alongside Sikh men. So this is a very interesting tale of gender equality. The fact that the protagonist is a woman is quite significant, but more generally, it's a tale of heroism and a struggle for justice. This was enormously popular when it came out, and it really inspired the Sikh masses in a way that is hard to imagine in the present. So very significant novel. Here's another example of Sikh prose, though one might almost call it poetry, because Puran Singh, who wrote this in this kind of style, was actually influenced somewhat by Walt Whitman, who was one of the pioneers of free verse in the mid-19th century in the United States. So Puran Singh started out as an academic, as a chemist, but he was inspired to leave that and to just write about the Sikh faith. And a lot of his writing is from the 1920s. This is from a collection called The Spirit of the Sikh. And in one of the early lectures, I talked about the 3 pillars of Sikhism: Naam Japo, Kirit Karo, Van Chako. Here, Professor Puran Singh takes these 3 ideals. He orders them slightly differently, starting with Kirit Karni and then Naam Japna and Van Chakna. But he adds a lot of poetic richness and expands on them in a way that seeks to universalize them. So, for example, when he's talking about Kirit Karni, he talks about other religious traditions as well. Again, Puran Singh was enormously popular at the time, and he's somewhat less well known now, but he was very significant in his influence on the community at this time of reformation and reform and revival, where the Sikh community was responding to the colonial power. Just another side note: these 3 ideals, Naam Japo, Van Chako, Kirat Karo, are actually, I think, can be traced to a different work by Veer Singh. So they're not actually found in the Guru Granth Sahib, but they represent, in some ways, a reworking of what the Guru Granth Sahib says, and that statement is from a novel by Veer Singh. Here's a modern Punjabi poet, Amrita Pritam. Again, she was not really a practicing Sikh, but I think one of the most significant Indian poets, and definitely Punjabi poets of the 20th century. And again, she brought not just a regional perspective, but also a very important perspective as a woman to her poetry. There's a lot of her poetry is more intimate and personal. The poem I'm going to show you as an example today is actually a poem about partition. So again, a connection to Sikh history and the history of the region and the whole subcontinent of South Asia. The poem is in Punjabi, but the translation of the title is I Ask Waris Shah Today. So as background, Waris Shah was an 18th century Punjabi Sufi poet. We talked earlier about Sufis and their influence on the Sikh tradition, and we mentioned the verses of Sheikh Farid, which I include in the Guru Granth Sahib. Waris Shah wrote a poem, Heer, based on a traditional tragic romance, Heer Ranja. So Heer and Ranja in this poem are young lovers. And there's a little bit of parallel with Romeo and Juliet, but also significant differences. Another major character in the poem is a relative of Heer's, Kaidon, who poisons her, and then indirectly Ranja as well, because he takes the same poison. So it ends with the death of both lovers, and Kaidon then makes an appearance in the poem. So this is just one verse from the poem I Ask Waris Shah Today. And in this, Amrita Pritam is addressing Waris Shah and saying to him that the tragedy of partition is just at such an enormous scale that it is unimaginable. It is much beyond that of a single couple. And she talks about especially the violence against women. And she says, today all the Kaidons have become the thieves of love and beauty. And where can we find another one like Waris Shah? Waris Shah, I say to you, speak from your grave and add a new page to your book of love. So this is really quite a remarkable, moving poem. which addresses again this event of terrible tragedy in the history of the region. The river Chenab is referred to in this poem. That's one of the 5 rivers of Punjab, and now it flows through Pakistan mostly. Now I'll turn to Sikhs and film. And again, this is a very large subject. I'll divide it into Hollywood, Bollywood, which is kind of a generic term used for the modern Hindi film industry based in Mumbai, which used to be Bombay, which is where the B comes from in Bollywood. I'll say a little bit about how the events of 9/11 in the U.S. Influenced some Sikh filmmaking. And then I'll also briefly introduce another Sikh response to telling their stories in this modern medium of film, this organization, Sikh Lens. So first I want to show you a clip from a Hollywood movie, Gandhi, made in 1982. This was an Academy Award winner. It featured Ben Kingsley as Gandhi, and it was really very much an old-style Hollywood epic, perhaps in the tradition of Ben-Hur and Lawrence of Arabia, but with this South Asian theme. And this clip shows the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919. Earlier, when I was talking about Sikh history, I had shown you stills, photographs from Jallianwala Bagh. This is a reenactment of the massacre from the movie Gandhi. It begins with the British troops arriving at Jallianwala Bagh, and there are marching soldiers and an armored car. The armored car cannot enter the garden, the square, because the passageway is too narrow, which actually was a blessing a limited blessing in the sense that it would have done even more damage to the people gathered there. But then the rest of the clip shows the beginnings of the massacre. Again, this is somewhat distressing, so if you don't want to watch that, of course, feel free to skip it. I've also stopped the clip before some of the worst scenes, and it is a very, very powerful reenactment of the massacre.
But if we riot, if we fight back, we become the vandals and they become the law. If we bear their blows, they are the vandals. God and his law are on earth. We must have the courage to take their anger.
Hamilton, Major. Should we issue a warning, sir?
They've had their warning. No meetings.
now that you've seen the clip, I'll just add a little bit. The movie then continues with the aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, how the British responded somewhat weakly, and how it actually energized the Indian freedom movement. So in some respects, this event marked a turning point in the Indian struggle for independence. And Sikhs really like to point out how, even as a very small minority, they were very much at the center of things in the freedom movement, whether it was with the actions of Bhagat Singh as a revolutionary or peaceful protesters in Jallianwala Bagh and so on. Now, I'd actually like to, when I was preparing this lecture, I was reminded of another event which I want to show you. So a slight digression into history. And this is actually documentary footage from 1922. And it shows what was happening in Guru Ka Bagh, which was another Gurdwara, part of the site of another Gurdwara. And again, there was a conflict between the Sikh community and the Mahant, the functionary who controlled the Gurdwara. So again, the same kind of issue that I showed you when illustrating what happened in Nankana Sahib. But this is actually documentary footage from a century ago. There's also a link in Canvas to a full account of what happened, but I just want to show you this short clip. It's less than 2 minutes long.
See how Sikhs were depicted with an image of mystical souls reinforced with misinformation. Just like today, the media is written by those in power. My heart is still in pain as I witness the footage of how one man can be so cruel to another.
So I was also reminded of this clip because later in the movie Gandhi, there's a scene where the Indian freedom fighters are marching up to British soldiers and being hit with long sticks and taking the blows without complaint. And that actually occurred after Guru Ka Bagh. So again, Sikhs were the first to use this form of protest, something that sometimes gets forgotten in historical accounts of the Indian freedom movement. Okay, back to Hollywood, and I'll just talk a little bit about Inside Man, which is a crime thriller directed by Spike Lee. Spike Lee is a wonderful director, and this is a really gripping movie. The protagonist is one of the main protagonists is Denzel Washington, but there's a small part in the beginning of the movie for Varis Ahluwalia. Varis Ahluwalia was featured in a couple of clips that I referred you to it very early in the class. Ahluwalia has appeared in several other Hollywood movies, in Wes Anderson movies, but there he's a background character. In this clip, his Sikh identity is integral to the scene. Before this clip, he's sent out by some bank robbers as from the hostages they're holding inside the bank, with a message for the police. But because he's wearing a turban, he's attacked by the police as a terrorist, and his turban is knocked off. And this clip that is available in Canvas shows you how he responds to the police and protests about his treatment by the police and how he's characterized as an Arab and so on. So again, it's a very I think a very sensitive portrayal of a Sikh in a Hollywood movie, and one wouldn't expect any different from Spike Lee. This is a different, very different movie, Learning to Drive, and coming back full circle to Ben Kingsley. So in Gandhi, Ben Kingsley plays the title character Gandhi, and of course looks very different. This is more than 3 decades later, so Ben Kingsley is a lot older, but he also now in this movie plays a Sikh. And in this movie, he plays a Sikh driving instructor. There are themes of immigration. There's, for example, an immigration raid which is featured in this movie, and some Sikhs who don't have papers are arrested. Ben Kingsley is luckily not part of. He's sharing the apartment, but he's not caught in the raid. It also shows how Ben Kingsley has an arranged marriage and how his wife comes over from India. And there are many other examples of cultural differences that are illustrated here. So in some ways, it's a sort of standard Hollywood movie, and it's maybe not a great movie, but it shows a Sikh as a central character, and the story very much revolves around his interaction with a middle-aged Western woman who's just gotten divorced and is learning to drive in New York for the first time. So again, it's a very interesting anthropological study, if not a great movie. So now I'll turn to Sikhs in Bollywood, and this has been a very checkered history for Sikhs. Sikhs were very much a marginalized community from the perspective of Bollywood. In early Hindi movies, they were typically stereotyped as, rustics or, warriors, not really being shown as, positive characters, but just as comic relief or something like that. That has changed a little bit, but there's still issues of Sikhs. Even when they are lead characters, they are invariably played by bankable stars. So just as in the Hollywood movie, the lead character, though he was a Sikh, was played by Ben Kingsley, dressed up with a beard and turban. Typically leading Hindi actors like Akshay Kumar, Ranbir Kapoor have basically dressed up as Sikhs to play the lead characters. I've included 3 clips which you can watch of examples of Sikhs in Hindi movies. The first is actually it's old enough that you can see the whole movie, but even clips will be worth watching. This movie is called Shaheed. Shaheed means martyr, and this is a movie based on the life of Bhagat Singh, who we've talked about in earlier lectures. And this actually was made in 1965. This was a time of very heightened patriotism in India, so there were a lot of movies being made which emphasized contemporary patriotism as well as the Indian independence movement. The other two movies are more contemporary, from 2008 and 2009. Sing is King was a big hit, a standard Hollywood action drama comedy with music, basically everything rolled into one. And the double N in King is not a typo. That was part of the title rendition in English. Again, this movie it's not a great movie, but it's a sort of standard Bollywood potboiler, but featuring Sikh as in the lead role, and he's good-hearted, but again, there's a little bit of stereotyping in the way he kind of carries himself. Finally, Rocket Singh, Salesman of the Year, is perhaps a little bit of progression from that kind of approach. It's more of a smaller movie. Rocket Singh is the nickname of the protagonist, and he's again shown as academically not very successful, but he's turns out he learns how to be a good salesman. And what is interesting is it shows some of his life as a Sikh and how he interacts with his older relatives, and how his Sikh values and ideals help him, or sometimes make it hard to navigate the difficulties of being a salesperson in a cutthroat Indian business. So it's a nice, gentle comedy with some romance, of course. Now I'll turn to Sikhs post 9/11, and 9/11, of course, was enormous event in U.S. history, leading both to a change in security, the security apparatus within the country, and also to the so-called global war on terror. So it has had long-lasting and ongoing effects on both this country and the world. For Sikhs, it was really, in some sense, a catastrophe, because even though none of the 9/11 hijackers had beards and turbans, after 9/11, there was the constant image of Osama bin Laden being flashed on TV screens, and sometimes Sikhs would also be represented in TV news as Muslim terrorists. So it was a time of great fear and struggle for Sikhs in the United States. In fact, the first post 9/11 casualty was a Sikh gas station owner in Arizona who was shot by somebody who decided that he was going to take revenge for 9/11. And that's where the title Mistaken Identity comes from. So this was a documentary made by a young filmmaker who wanted to explain who the Sikhs are and describe what was going on to Sikhs after 9/11. And this was very important. A similar documentary, there's a couple of clips. One is talking about the making of the movie, and the other is the opening sequence, Divided We Fall, again talking about Sikhs and other minorities in the context of post 9/11 America. So I think these would be very important examples to watch. And we'll come back to these themes when we talk about Sikhs in the diaspora and in the United States in particular. Finally, I'll briefly talk about Sikh Lens, which is a project started by a Sikh entrepreneur based in Southern California. And he created a film festival in Southern California, which has now expanded to having festivals in other cities. Basically, he's been funding making of films with various themes about Sikhs and featuring the Sikh community. He's also created an association with Chapman University in Southern California to get young people, not just Sikhs, involved in making movies about Sikh themes. So there are 3 clips which you can watch later. The first one is about Insaf. Insaf is a non-profit organization which is dedicated to documenting the human rights violations that occurred from 1984 till the mid-90s, and actually to some extent have been continuing in Punjab. And it's been documenting the lives of young people who disappeared in that time, who basically were taken prisoner and never found again. So the police and army, in order to crush the Sikh militancy and to put down what they saw as a revolt against the Indian state, really resorted to very brutal tactics. So Insaf is basically a truth project, project to get justice for victims. It also identifies some of the perpetrators and talks about them as well, former members of the police. Guru Ramdas is actually a completely different film. It actually is about Guru Ramdas, but it's actually very lovely, almost poetic shadow play, illustrating the life of Guru Ramdas. So it's very unusual, very nice to watch. And finally, Humble the Poet is about a Sikh rapper, a hip-hop artist based in Canada. And he's very well known in the Sikh community, the Sikh diaspora community, especially the young. And again, he represents what one might call part of the millennial generation, really using media in general and social media to make statements about social justice, both for the Sikh community and also more widely for society and the globe at large. There are many other examples of Sikh film in Hollywood, in Bollywood, and young Sikhs making films, but this I hope will give you an introduction for further exploration.